I just had a small observation, and I'm not into new media or anything, so it might be slightly vulgar, I don't know. But the clip that you showed us at the end really made it evident, made your argument about habit really evident. But I was just wondering how this is different from what human beings do anyway. I mean, we all just brush our teeth in the morning and eat breakfast. And so what is the point of seeing it literalized on YouTube where people, even in the awareness that they're uploading something unique, know that they belong to a whole category of related videos and genres? So I'm just wondering how the way you pit habit as a form of defense and not a symptom of new media, how does that make it any different from how we are as human beings either way? So it was just something I was thinking of.
That's a great question. And to be clear, for me, habit isn't simply a defense or a symptom, but rather it lies right at the middle. And so what's important for me about habit is that it unsettles actually the notion of defense and symptom. But one thing that I think is important to think about these videos and what they're doing is to engage with them at the level of the vlog. And what is it that the vlog does, right? Because the vlog is an interesting form of publicity in the sense that it's the private subject being publicly viewed. It's relentlessly, you saw the home, you saw the thing. It's very much the notion that these are private subjects being viewed in public. Now, if you look at, say, the traditional theories of democracy, right, the idea is that the public subject is on the outside and not the inside, right? That when you're inside the home, this is Tom Keenan's argument, looking at the architectural window, outside of the window, you're the public subject that acts behind the window, you're the private subject that can look on, the theorizing subject. So what's interesting about this is it's the switch, right? The public subject is actually the one that's on the inside, which is why there's also a vague creepiness to it, right? Because you feel like you're intruding on a private space. And so I think that's absolutely key to think through relations of publicity and privacy, but also, and what I do in the final chapter of the book is link it to what I call an epistemology of outing. And to say, to think through why and what is this epistemology of constant exposure doing, and to what extent is exposure itself a critical act or completely compelled within this space of inversion between public and private. So very much going from Sedgwick's epistemology of the closet to the epistemology of outing.
I wanted to pick up on something you said earlier on, which is this to be updated. And I can see that when we're always being asked to update our security things and update our programs, and whether we like it or not, Windows insists on updating us every day when we're trying to put the computer off or whatever it is and drives us crazy. But I was wondering about whether this is just a specific sort of thing you're using to talk about how hackers intervene with programs and software has to keep on going. But how about if you take that into the realm of this, mass ornament thing, this idea of how it is that people they're updating skills and so on, they're updating some of their interactions to something that's a new form of interaction. Mm-hmm. But at the other side, there's a kind of a tribalism or something about it, which feels like not updating at all, but actually some kind of regression. So is updating at the level of what's happening there, those people with those cameras in their rooms doing these weird things? I guess I just want you to talk a little bit more about what that is. I mean, in terms of, because as you were saying, it's a kind of an individual thing and a collective thing, that it's a public thing and a private thing. But in terms of that sociality, in terms of what it is people are doing with each other, is it really a new form, or is it some kind of updating of a kind of very much like being in a village? Or, maybe you can talk about it some more. It's just
right.
to be updated is okay at the software level, but what does it mean at this other level?
No, I think that's a great question. And again, part of what I'm trying to do is get us away from the question of what is new about, and try to think through the ways in which these things are constantly renewed. But I think that what's key about that question is trying to think through update in various ways, because it's not simply that screen and your computer is constantly being refreshed, even when it appears to be doing nothing, right? So there's a way in which there must be this engagement in order for you to have what seems to be the same thing, right? But also what was striking about those videos and in this question, the question of the collective is the weird way in which Natalie insists on putting the number of views in, right? And so what you see is that this video, even as a personal vlog, is never simply personal, but always framed within who else has watched it, right? And what's interesting about that question of the number of views and linking that to somehow the collective is that it also brings out the lovely ways in which these things lie, right? So there are ways to hack the system so you get as many views as you know, like millions of views, right? So even when it seems to be telling you what it's doing and how many numbers are actually there, it's also implying a creative relation to the social. But it's based on the idea that somehow someone needed to have clicked to update it in order for it to register. But I think also in more general, to be updated was thinking, well, first of all, through the temporality of media and the ways in which if you don't update something, you'll lose it, right? Just at a very technical level. But also through various ways in which social media has focused on the update, right? So just to give you one banal example, there was the famous example of the kid who went with his girlfriend to the Peruvian rainforest and shockingly enough stopped updating his Facebook page. And his mother was very worried, got the US government and the Peruvian government to fly their military planes in, find him apparently at some cafe outside the rainforest. But she wouldn't believe he was alive until he updated his Facebook page, right? So we took him to a cafe. But I think there is a way in which that constant pinging, right, is a registration. And that it's both a technical thing that one must constantly ping in order to remain, but also the question of what now counts as being in trouble. It's not the constant cry for help, but the absence.
The use for silence.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I really, really enjoyed that. And there's so many directions it's going. So I probably have picked the worst one to ask a question about. But you talk about the new media wonderfully moving into the social media and after the dot-com burst. And could it be said that we're actually in an anti-social media type of term? Because I really liked your turn of phrase that there are those people who want that like us and those people who are like us, right? You know, that are like us and those people are like us. And so many people want to be liked for whatever content they throw out and want to see that they are like others, like I'm normal because, or I'm, I'm better than this person or I'm like this person. But there's also the sense too that it's on our own terms as well. And there's a sense that we'd rather be a voyeur seeing these other things and actually showing ourselves, it's a very mediated like. You only get to see the best of me, but I want to see all of you. So isn't it really more kind of an anti-social media type of thing that we're moving into?
No, I think that's a great question, and I think we grant too much to social media if we let it determine the terms of the social. But I wonder if, at the same time, anti-social is necessarily what it is as well, right? Because there's ways in which these are now embedded in actions that aren't simply completely mediated, right? So it's not like I get to see everything, but I only show the best of myself. There's ways in which there are bizarre moments of interchange. And so Fiona Barnett is doing this really interesting analysis of selfies. And rather than to say this is just narcissism, she's arguing that it's linked to a desire for an indexical location. So because selfies are usually ones of taking pictures, right? And so trying to figure out actually markers within space and then looking at the ways the images spread as its a marker of sociality. I also think that there's an interesting pushback onto the whole notion of new media. So Florian Kramer's written a really brilliant piece called post-digital media. And what he notes there, and I think this gets to the question of habitual remaining, is that post-digital media is analog media done digitally, right? So think about, like, you know, zines. Remember zines? You were an angry young child. You went to the photocopier. You made your zine, right? Now it's like, okay, guys, we'll all get together, have a meetup. We're going to do the zine, and then we're going to get it out, right? So even though it's this mechanical thing, it's this logic of the digital that also infiltrates it. So I think that's a really interesting take in thinking through that relationship as well. But what I would also say is that what's important is to realize that even when you think you're not being social, because you're constantly being compared to people who are like you, even if you're not, that there's a way in which you're being embedded in ways that aren't as simple as I'm choosing this and you're revealing this.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
A complete aside, I was very, very irrationally happy to see Siegfried Krakauer and the Tiller Girls updated for the 21st century. That was great. I love that video. My question's kind of going back to Victoria's and the way that you were talking about the desperate need to have the Facebook update even in the midst of the Peruvian jungle. So we have to have that update because otherwise we don't know that the person exists, they're still alive, and so on. It's an index of their, you know, simple existence. Soon that'll absolutely be the case with, like, you know, Toronto Dominion accessing your bank account by your unique heart signature, or the Google Watch, or the Apple Watch, or the Google Baseline Project. All of those things are ways that we're going to be able to index someone's presence, but it's also vital that we're doing that just by, you know, articulating it ourselves and putting the Facebook update out there. So there's this continual drive to update, and given that the update has to be made public or has to be stored somewhere, how is it the case that we can have leaky media that have some kind of a memory but aren't stored? Like you talked at one point about how it's important that we have an ethics or a politics or even a policy of just letting memory go and not keeping everything. And I'm wondering, don't we have some kind of bias or tendency against that that's almost built in? Like, how do you fight against that, basically? Like, how do we have any kind of forgetfulness given that the medium itself seems to want to remember in some, like, almost agential sense?
I think that's a great question, and I think we also have to realize that technological defaults can be changed.
Sure.
That the decision to store everything is a political decision rather than a technological one. And so I think part of it is rethinking the ways our technologies operate. And in this sense, I think that the right to be forgotten is too late. Once we talk about the right to be forgotten, you've already lost the battle. It would be the question of the not being captured in the first place. But there are some places like India where the sysops and the media companies didn't keep files, didn't keep records of everything. And now they're being forced by the government to do so. So we need to think through the ways in which these are being put in place, and that they're not outside of questions of politics rather than simply questions of technology.
So these are policy questions then. Like someone like Andrew Feenberg is going to be right when he says that these are issues about democracy to fight for. They're not issues about, say, media theory or the technology itself.
I think the two are intertwined, and that we have to think the two together, and the ways in which the idea of storage has become a way. Why is everything stored? Because it's viewed as a way to solve the problem of terrorism, right?
Yeah.
And so we have to think through the linkages between the politics of storage and the politics and the problems they're allegedly solving.
Thank you.
I too was curious about this need to update. And I was struck by your formula, which was habit plus crisis equal update. And I just wanted to say a few things about that, but then what I'd like you to do is say more about that. And what struck me about that is that seems to me not just to explain our contemporary situation with technology, that kind of restlessness. You could almost if I'm understanding it properly, understand the history of modern art, for example. That you have painting in a realist frame, and then you get impressionism and expressionism and abstract expressionism, and there is this restlessness. There's a habit formed of doing things, even understanding things in a particular way. There's some crisis that happens, and there's a need to update. I would dare say, without going into a lot of detail, you could even maybe look at the history of science that way. So what I would be interested in is for you to say more about that formula, habit plus crisis equals update.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think that, I think Heidegger actually had it most beautifully in Being in Time when he was talking about the they subject is constantly and searching for the new, but also therefore not wanting the new. It's the search that matters than the thing itself. And I would say, yes, of course, that there is a history to this. But the point that I'm trying to think through is the ways in which habit is now being unsettled, right? Because there was a way in which habit was once discussed as a form of habitation, right? That this is Felix Reveson's beautiful formulation of habit in the 19th century. Basically outside sensation becoming interior spontaneity, right? So you no longer have to rely on the outside because you produce it within yourself, right? So that one becomes inhabited to it. And this is wonderful moment of autonomy, he argues, comes from habit. Now, if you look at the ways in which habits are being discussed, to actually be inhabited is to be pathologized, right? It's that moment in which habit is completely being disrupted, so it's becoming addiction. So Charles Duhigg, in his really influential book on habit, talks about habits like alcoholism, right? And the idea is you recognize these habits in order to disturb them. The idea is you constantly have to undermine them. And like just to return to that notion of phantom vibrations, how many of you get phantom vibrations? Cell phone you think is vibrating, but it's not really vibrating? Yeah. So now this is allegedly a syndrome, and it's being pathologized, right? But if you think about to Revesson, why isn't this just wonderful, right? You now are spontaneously producing this sensation, so you no longer need to rely on technology, right? So why is that being pathologized? So more, I'm thinking through the temporality of it, and also in the relationship of sort of Milton Friedman's, thesis on neoliberalism, which is neoliberalism needs to take advantage of every crisis. So what you need to do is have everything in place so that when things go south, you have another habit in place.
I think one of the things that's difficult in an analytic talk that goes by quickly is always to distinguish between what is a statement about sort of social ontology and what is more a statement about the way we talk about the society or about new things in it. And in a way, when I hear you talking about habit, habituation, I think what it resonates to me is it resonates with someone like Castoriadis and the whole notion of the imaginary institution of society. And I was quite struck by your example about the internet when you talked about the sort of the utopian myths of the internet, or the utopianization of the internet as something of a kind of disembodiment that creates equality. And you showed that advertisement by the MCI advertisement about the post-racial, post-gender kind of thing delivered by MCI. And clearly there we're dealing with a kind of imaginary institution of ideology, and the kind of a story that's being told about what kind of connections are going to be happening here. And I know in your books you talk about other ways in which people tell the stories about network connections, and again we're dealing with something imagined. And obviously there are narratives and stories about not just ideology, but the institution of personality, the institution of subjectivity, the whole institution of ways in which we understand agency and habits and everything else there as well. And so I was kind of wondering, what do you find, let's say, persuasive counter-narratives or other stories, or other ways of talking about these situations? I know that your attracted to the kind of Horatian formula for the epic poet. It says, start in the middle of the action. You don't tell the story of Troy from ab ovo, from the egg, but put the reader in the middle of the action, and then just somehow take stock of the neighborhood, and the relationships in it. But I just wonder if you have some examples maybe of counter narratives, not necessarily academic ones, other narratives that might be persuasive and that might, give us some kind of sense about how to begin to orient in the middle of these things, and which, as you show, are very complex and contradictory, and have both promise and danger.
Right. I think that's a great question, and one thing I would say is, in the book, what I turn to is the imagining of loitering. That if these networks are fundamentally public, what might loitering look like? And it comes from a beautiful book called Why Loiter, about the streets of Mumbai. And they argue that in order for women to have access to public space, what they need to have is the right to loiter, the right to be able to take risks in public space. Because the rhetoric of safety is bizarrely framed, so if you want to be safe, don't go out in public. And in order for women to be safe, we have to get rid of these unsavory Muslim men, right? So then who's left in the street, right? So they want to think through the politics of loitering and how might loitering look like. And I think that's a powerful way to think through what might our engagements with networks look like if we view ourselves as loitering in them.
I mean, these the kind of images that are being produced by, say, analysts like yourself or academics, or do you find kind of contradictory stories and narratives within the new media and promulgated on a kind of larger basis? I mean, are these other narratives becoming part of big data? Are these other narratives becoming part of the kind of emerging or major net stories, images of this thing? Or are we just still talking here about what academics can do to sort of take stock of the situation?
Well, that's a slightly different question. And one thing I would say is, so recently I started working with some, getting in dialogues with more computer scientists and other people working in big data. And it's fascinating. And one thing that's interesting and that has created dialogues between humanists and technologists is that now, and this is something we were talking about during break, what's interesting now is that we're all facing the question, what is the relationship between what's real and true? Now with big data, any correlation can be shown, but which correlations matter? And I think this question of the relationship between correlation and truth is something that's across and something that we all need to deal with. Now, the people in business, right, they want to understand big data in certain ways, like if you do this, you might do this. It's second level correlation of habits because they want to keep you within a certain predictable space, right? But there's a way in which you can think through these correlations in surprising ways. So it's not like, if you don't want to be obese, stop hanging out with obese people, but maybe we can start thinking about these questions of obesity differently, precisely by taking these correlations seriously.
Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Stelios Pappas. Might I say you're all very, very intimidating individuals. My question.
Just talk to me. Yeah.
Before my question, I have to explain something to you because will lead into my question. In an attempt to renew my presence on the online social media site of Facebook, had changed my profile picture that was only a week old to the exact same kind of pose I had, and nothing really changed. And somebody, who I've hardly ever spoken to, had asked me, or kind of just commented, said, "Hey, you look like you gained some weight." And I was like, "Really? Oh, that's fantastic," But I didn't have much to say to that person. It wasn't a part of my habit. So does another's expectation go into this sense of habitual nature?
Absolutely. And I think that the question of expectation is also interesting if we stay with Facebook. Remember what happened when live feed started? There was this huge uproar saying that this was surveillance, right? Which was strange because Facebook was actually just showing you what it already knew about you, right? And yet this was viewed as somehow breaking trust. But what was interesting about the news feed was precisely a way in which it was putting into place relations between people as what is central. And I think that there's a different way of answering this question as well. And this is some of the network analytics work that's being done right now around Facebook that allegedly revealed that Facebook is engaged in social engineering because it played with people's news feed and gave them sadder feeds, and if they gave them sadder feeds, people posted sadder things, and they posted happier things, they posted happy. But that was a really bizarre understanding of it because it only depended on keywords, right? Suddenly, you know, so therefore a keyword became a marker for mood, right? But I do think there's a way in which repetition happens and response that's absolutely key.
I am very interested in this notion of enduring ephemerality. So you say that to call something new is also to say that it will one day be old, and I like that. And it reminds me of this Paul Virilio thing, like the invention of the ship was also the invention of the shipwreck. So the invention of the iPhone 6 is also the invention of the iPhone 6 landfill. So I just have my notes. I also get nervous talking in front of people, if that's not evident. So I'm just wondering about maybe the invention of obsolescence itself. I wonder, and I don't even know quite what the question is, but where can this go? Like, how fast can we go until obsolescence itself kind of explodes or implodes? Do you see the possibility of any stabilization as far as this ephemerality and constant moving go? I don't know. Do you see anything toward the future in that way?
I think that's a great question. And what I would say in response to that is that what's intriguing to me is that things now become ubiquitous in their obsolescence. So Friendster's gone, but friends are everywhere, right? The BlackBerry's gone, but phantom vibrations remain. So to what extent is, by thinking about things in terms of obsolescence versus non-obsolescence, are we missing the ways in which things remain?
Right, and I think like maybe much like capitalism, we can hardly imagine the end of Facebook at this time. So I don't know, I try to imagine a world without Facebook, and that's difficult. So it's almost as though Facebook has planted itself in a way that other things have not been able to. So I don't know where I'm going with that. Yeah.
The other thing is Facebook imagines a world in which there is no Facebook. That's what keeps Facebook going. Right? It's the fear that Facebook will become irrelevant, that it's constantly upgrading and trying to figure out different ways of doing things. So they live with the constant fear of obsolescence. This drives the valley.
And people are always so uncomfortable with that moving on and changing, right? In Facebook anyway.
Yeah. And so, but there's ways in which things remain without remaining, and that's really a fascinating question, right? So Facebook, I'm not sure. So I just found this out when I went from Waterloo to Princeton, which was the most bizarre experience on earth. You know, nice undergrad engineering, Waterloo, suddenly English literature at Princeton. And Facebooks were actually given to, they're what people, they're key to that sort of creepy sense of community that's so key to liberal arts colleges. You know, you get a Facebook and there'd be a picture and a name, and so people would invite girls to house parties based on the Facebook. When I taught at Harvard, we were all given a Facebook, so we could pretend we knew who you were because there was your photo there and we were supposed to engage with you. So there's a way in which that sort of creepy sense of community has remained even though that sort of Facebook isn't there anymore. And the other way to think about it is think about the ways people use cell phones, right? If you want salacious gossip, social security numbers, trade secrets, credit card numbers, just go next to somebody in public on the phone, right? Because for some reason they think as soon as they answer the phone, some dome of silence comes down, right? And that's arguably a remnant from the home phone, which is gone. So I think that thinking through the ways in which these things remain even as they go away is a way to get away from that constant move towards the next thing.
A quick question. Thinking about habits and habituation, I keep coming back to the notion of resonance, and keep thinking about resonance and try to bring these two concepts together in some way. Now, given your background in engineering, I was thinking maybe you have some thoughts on that, especially, you know, if two systems come into resonance, you can enforce resonances, you can enforce resonance frequencies, you can, the two systems can come into an eigenbehavior, right? They can form, and that's, you know, on another level, that's what, you know, you could call a habit, right? Or an habituation in some way or another. So I was thinking maybe you have some thoughts of how to bring these together.
That's interesting, right? So when bridges go into resonant frequency, that is so bad, but so awesome to see the bridges go into the little sine wave.
I mean, and that's interesting,
yeah.
that terms into a task.
Right.
And that's what we call resonance of task.
Right.
Before that, we have productive and constructive and destructive.
It's frequency. I think what's nice about the notion of resonance is it actually, I would put it more in terms of the enduring ephemeral. So this which seems to be there and stable is actually due to this constant action. And so that's how I would think through it, and bring those two concepts together.
Thank you, I think. I say thank you because it's such a lovely lecture and it's so full of elegance and range and this lovely vitality. And I say I think because it really depresses me. And I'm usually fairly good at dealing with depression, and sometimes by asking meaningless questions. And with this one, I mean, what you've given me is this picture of a world I don't want to be in. And it's rather like reading some domestic interior description in Balzac. And there's nowhere I would less like to live than one of those rooms that Balzac describes. And you've described in great detail a similar kind of space. And you know, it makes me want to escape, to run away to a rainforest. Well, I do that, and I don't have Facebook, so nobody can find me there, and nobody even bothers to send the army in to discover me. But you know, what forms of resistance are possible in this world? In previous technological systems, I've always imagined that it was possible to imagine a form of resistance to them. My resistance is based entirely on incompetence to this one. You know, I can't do most of the things that I'm supposed to do to get into this world that I don't want to be in. And the or the unsilent, but yeah, maybe. But we're becoming a minority, and that's bothering, isn't it? So, what ways are possible? You know, you talked about the post-digital media, and this zine that is recreated out of an entirely different set of social networks, and I like the idea of that. It's a nice kind of performative idea, but do you waken up and try to imagine ways of getting away from this, other than going back to you know, algebraic equations?
For me, new media is so interesting because it's so wonderfully creepy. I do think it's wonderfully creepy, and I think that it's dangerous in an interesting way. And I think that the question becomes more interesting as soon as we realize and deal with its wonderful creepiness rather than trying to get away from it and saying, like, either the technological solution, I will build, you know, a secure system, right? Which secure systems are never entirely secure, right? Or this idea of getting away, which unfortunately marks you even more strongly, right, within statistical parameters, right? So I think that the question of the production of noise becomes interesting. I think the question of how one engages with these things becomes interesting. And again, if we treat networks as public, then what it also makes possible is the imagining of different spaces that are other than that, if we want to have something like privacy or security. Like if it makes possible an engagement with other spaces and other modes of contact. But I do think that in order to imagine those spaces or to do other things, what we first have to do is deal with that wonderful creepiness and ask ourselves, like, how did this ever become a personal computer, right? Given that it's constantly talking with all yours, what happened, right? And so from there, how can we imagine the personal differently? So I think that those all stem from there. But I would say that the desire to just get off the map, which is certainly what a lot of people have, just makes you even more markable.
Interesting. But that critique, which you're living inside in a way, a critique of the media that surround you, and you know, which we've always done in a way, whatever the dominant medium is that we're surrounded by. That critique is a different kind of critique now, isn't it, if I understand you correctly? Because the framework of the critique is totally infiltrated by the object of the critique.
Right.
And so there's no way of establishing any kind of separate space from which to view it.
Right. Yeah, it's infiltrated, and it's insidious because it takes moves to get away from it as actually what it needs to build the better thing. But I would also say to be within it, we're not all in it in the same way. And because we're not in it in the same way, perhaps we can have different modes of inhabitation. This is where I think the move towards inhabitation for me is actually fascinating. If one inhabits these things, how can one inhabit them differently? And there I talk about in the book note card videos and the ways in which they've become important ways and we are the 99%, you know, ways of insisting on some sort of taking this insidious call to constantly being individual and actually occupy template. So I think that there are modes and that being within isn't the end, because critique, if it's a form of witnessing, theory is a form of witnessing, then one is part of the mode and where one is witnessing.
Thank you.
I just want to very briefly follow up on that question because I thought it was really interesting. And I mean, if I understand you correctly, the picture that you're describing is not the Borg. I mean, this world is not, you know, we are the Borg, resistance is futile.
Right.
And so there's a meaning to Ian's question. It's just that maybe that you're going to reconfigure it in the way you started to talk about it. Instead of talking about resistance as that word, you talk about different kinds of inhabitation and something like that. And I just wondered if you just a little bit expand on that, if I understand you correctly, to show what it is about the world you're describing, which is not the Borg. It's not some kind of collective machining of everyone in the same way, so that it does make possible different types of inhabitation and therefore the kinds of, you know, potential conflicts and contradictions and different outcomes that may come out of that.
So one example that I use, and I think, the book actually started at one point with a description of the Borg and said how that was just such a colloquial imagining of what the network would actually be like. You know, this idea somehow the network meant sameness as opposed to the proliferation of individual differences, yet habits. And I think that one example that I do think through at the end is, so I look at the Amanda Todd's suicide video, and the ways in which she uses a note cards in order to tell her story. And what's interesting about the note card video is that it's become a form that all these teens use, right? But rather than saying, okay, it's not original, or it's why is there one that's real and these are not real? And there's been all sorts of discussions around these note card videos in terms of whether or not they're authentic, right? Rather than thinking through it in terms of authentic or non-authentic, right? Ask the question, what does it mean to engage with writing and note card videos and absolute templates in order to tell what is allegedly a story that can't be told of individual suffering, right? And so to look at those moments of these bizarre occupations of these templates as moments to think through. And then I do the reference to Jean-Luc Nancy and now I'm breaking things, and his question of writing and the inoperable community as one way to think through things.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a question. It kind of goes back to our conversation at the break. It's somewhat related to the way this conversation has been going. And it picks up those parts of your talk where the word analogy came up. And I was struck by, if you want, a dissonance between the conceptual, ordinary words that you used, which I'm very familiar with in my own work, like transparency, opacity, private, public, these kind of words, and how they were actually not sticking to what you were talking about in my relationship to them. The word silence was another one that came up because I just this week had to write this concluding paragraph about silence in World War I. And I covered Wittgenstein and silence, and I covered gas and silence. I covered lots of silences to explain transcendence and silence, to explain the title of this book, Into the Silence, by an author. And then this word silence came up in your talk also, sort of came streaking across. And I found that, and that got me thinking about this passage in philosophy from metaphysics to ordinary language with Wittgenstein. And how what Wittgenstein was going to do is going to take these concepts which had come to be rarefied and come to lost their usage through a certain kind of generality, and that somehow they would be brought back into ordinary language. And ordinary language was, in terms of its habitus, really adequate, in fact, to do an awful lot of work. In fact, there was no reason why we shouldn't have confidence or believe that ordinary language, in fact, could do that work. And yet, your discourse really actually tells me something about the inadequacy of that language to, in fact, talk about the phenomena that you're, in fact, describing. And that it's kind of like maybe we're talking about some kind that we don't actually have a language to actually account for, or to even understand what constitutes accounting for, explanation, or anything with respect to what you're talking about. You're doing a really masterful job, you know. That's why I'm saying I was with you all the way through this talk. But somehow or other, I just sort of said, it's almost as if the language that we have had and that we've inherited over all this time as being our treasure house, going back to Ferdinand de Saussure and what is that, has exhausted itself with respect to what you're talking about. And so, on one hand, I compliment you for your eloquence in all this, but at the same time, I felt that the language that we share, our intellectual language, our theoretical language, has something inadequate about it with respect to what you're talking about. So that's my comment to. And so I was just the last thing I was saying. I'm very glad that we're going to get back to questions having to do with correlation and truth. But that's how we got into the thing about analogy in the first place. And there's something at the same time which has come to be, I don't know, threatened or something. But please. That's it for my talk? Is that it? Yeah. Okay. So anyway, that's my comment.
Right. No, I think that's a fantastic comment, but I would again say that the question of the inadequacy of this language is actually something that's productive. And so the way I talk about it in terms of program visions, where I actually take on the limitations of the language of opacity and transparency, and is that bizarrely, computers have become metaphors for metaphor itself, right? It's become this metaphor for a general logic of substitutability. And this is what we could call analogy, the general logic. But what's really strange about somehow saying, oh yeah, culture is just like software, or that's just the way I'm coded or wired, is that what one is doing, usually metaphor explains what's unknown by referring to what's known, right? But when you say something's like software, I mean, you're explaining something by something that's unknowable, right? So I'm trained as an engineer, and I can tell you theoretically what my computer is doing at every level, but I can't tell you what it's doing right now, right? But so the point is that it's that coupling of knowability and unknowability that arguably makes the computer such a compelling metaphor for a world in which it's so complex that we're constantly dealing with that linkage between the unknowable and the knowable. So I would say that the limitation of language there is actually symptomatic of precisely these issues, rather than something, and that's where things get really interesting.
Should we call it on that? Good, thank you very much. It was a long
Thank you very much, Wendy. I have a little presentation here, but I want to thank you first. It's a really wonderful talk. Actually, unlike my dear friend Ian, I found it rather upbeat and optimistic, not in a romantic sort of way, but in a more stoical sort of way. But I think it's a good approach. In any case, I want to thank you very much for bringing this to us, and I think it will stimulate more discussion in the days to come and in the weeks to come. I know you'll have another session tomorrow morning where we'll get some more into all of these things. But I think, I'm not sure everybody knows here, but you're actually now, what you brought to us is from your unpublished work. It's something that you're working on now that's yet to be published. And I think that's an extraordinary act of generosity to bring to us something that is so much on the cutting edge of your own thinking and unfinished, and that you're willing to share with us. And I think, from my point of view, I think I speak for everyone when I say we really do appreciate that, and we want to thank you for it. So now we do have a little object for you to take away with you. It's a courtesy of the PhD program, and I think Jonathan is the creator of it, but he's notoriously shy, and so he asked me to make the presentation to you. So go ahead and open it, and we will certainly remember this talk, and maybe this will help you to remember us for a little while as well.
Oh, it's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you again.